Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
We'll begin. Nora has not arrived yet. At least I don't think she's here. But I suggest we start and then Bonnitta and then Ria can have a conversation and hopefully Nora arrives. So welcome to the Stoa. For those of you who've been here or first timers, the Stoa is a place for us to cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa. And today we have Bonnitta Roy, Nora Bateson, and Ria Baeck here for a three-way emergent conversation. So just a quick intro, which I scraped off of their bios. If you don't know these three ladies, Bonnitta is an award-winning author, philosopher, and insight guide. Nora Bateson is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and educator. And Ria is a transformational change professional who discovered a modality called collective presencing. And these, Nora, Bonnitta, and Ria are friends of the Stoa. They've been here before. And how this session came about is Bonnitta's like, let's have a three-way conversation with myself, Nora, and Ria. And there's not many rules at the Stoa, but one of them is what Bonnitta wants, Bonnitta gets. And so I'm like, let's do it. And I think Nora said, like, let's have no theme, no structure. Let's just go in for a conversation. So we just like, let's throw it up there. And here we are. So how it's going to work, I was going to take in Bonnitta in to set the frame. And hopefully Nora arrives. But if not, we'll make do as good meta-stoics. And then they'll have a conversation. And then if you have any questions throughout, just throw it in the chat box. And then at some point, I imagine there'll be a pivot to some collective questioning. So that being said, I will allow everyone to unmute themselves. Let everyone keep themselves on mute except Bonnitta and Ria at this point. So I'll take you in now, Bonnitta.
Okay. So we had a little brief back and forth to see how we might frame this. You know, the title is Wisdom Practices, and there's collective presence, warm data, and insight practice. So what do these three have in common? There's a sense in which, I mean, it's very obvious to me that what Ria and Nora bring is they're the few people that I know that truly understand holistic complexity, that truly take nonlinear systems dynamics seriously. In their work, they do not compromise. And I know from my own work, there are times where you do a workshop and there are people who are very complex thinkers, very sophisticated intelligence that do a lot of their due diligence. And they use the term complexity systems or systems complexity. But there's a sense in which you can tell they're mind mapping all these feed loops that may be feed forward and feedback, as if theoretically you could get in the system and see all the parts and how they're related. And that's not what holistic systems are. You can't get in between action and reaction, you see? And so there's always a challenge when you're working in this field to try to point out to people that no, that's not what you're talking about. Like, no, that's just not it. It's, and it's frustrating because these are people who really do their due diligence, put a lot of work and effort into it. And yet there's a kind of a hard boundary. They're just not in this holistic, non-linear approach. They're just not. And I know that Ria is uncompromised because she'll point this out in our own work together. And the first time I met Nora, I was asking her about her father, and I was saying, you know, it's hard to read him because he uses terms like cybernetics. And I was like, well, what is he really getting at? And she just laid out this view of the nature of reality, the nature of the world, that was truly in what I call holistic complexity. I just use that term to separate it from systemic complexity. And so I'm kind of stalling because Nora's going to be here very shortly. But this is the seed that we want to try to, how can we better language or point out the difference? And do we have stories or examples and how we kind of deal with that in this field? So yeah, that's what we're hoping to build, that wisdom skill of truly inhabiting nonlinear dynamics in a holistic system. Yeah. So when Nora comes in, we can ask her the same question. So my question for you, Ria, is like, how do you point out the difference? Like, how do you help people move from maybe where they're stuck to a view that's truly holistic or nonlinear?
Just to jump in, Nora has just arrived, I believe.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I made it, yeah. Okay.
Can you hear us, Nora?
I hear you fine. I just had one of those Zoom panic moments where nothing opens, nothing works. So, but anyway, here I am. Hi. Glad to be
Hi.
here. What did I miss?
You didn't miss anything. I was stalling.
Good.
And basically, oh, there you are. And basically talked about how we were going to talk about nonlinear thinking and how I said that I could count on my hands the number of people I think really don't compromise nonlinear thinking when they address systems complexity. And of course, you two are two people that I know that to be the case. And I was talking about in my own work, and I'm sure this is, or I'm guessing this is for you too, you'll be working with people and they'll use the word complexity systems or complex thinking, but they're not really doing that. They're actually have a lot of like linear, if they could theoretically, they think they could mind map, they're always coming up with these mind maps, of all this complex. And so how do you language or how do you build that skill that people can exit that? And I was saying, like, a lot of times these people, they've done so much due diligence, they read, they study our work, and yet they're still kind of like that click hasn't happened where, oh my God, now I get it. So that was the ramp up. And, if you have stories or any way we can illustrate this.
Oh, so many stories. And I guess for me, part of that has to do with the tension of being caught in a culture where what is expected at a professional level and in circles of change making, et cetera, not just change making, organizational development, academic work around systemic thinking, is that there is some way to solve it. And there's something deeply entrenched, I don't know, we can call it mechanistic, we can call it linear, we can call it whatever that thing is. It's some kind of control assumption. And you can use all the vocabulary in the book. You can talk about emergence, and you can talk about interdependency and interconnectedness and interrelatedness, and you can talk about coupling and decoupling and complexity. And the second you start with the idea that you're going to have a goal, more than likely, or you have any kind of measurements in the process of getting to that goal, boom, you lost it. And there's just not very many circumstances in which it's acceptable to approach the difficult situations of our world without measurements and goals. So I don't know where the issue is. Is it in the actual perception of complexity, or is it in the way that there is an expectation to be in the world around it? It seems like there's some paradoxical reflective issues happening at that level.
Yeah, I want to pick up from there. I think the mold that we are in, the thinking mold of Western thinking, and that's what I learned from you, Bonnie, is that very, very either or. And it's either a solution or it's either not a solution. It's good or it's bad, or it's light or it's darker. And even it's to actually grasp that you live in complexity, and that even if you try all these maps or the actual experience of and in some way we know that life is not linear. I mean, we try to have friends and relationships and then they stop, and even against our will and our expectation. But it seems like we have to bring ourselves out of the mold of that dualistic thinking that is so ingrained, and to adapt something else which is very fluid and very not clear. For many people that's like, ugh, because I think we are educated like, okay, one is two, and if you do this then that, and which is all that linear thinking. And what I find when I try to explain difference between complicated and complex, as Dave Snowden brings it, that let people understand that in a complex system, they actually have agency. I've worked quite a lot with people from the European Commission, and then they kind of understand complexity, and then they fall back into what we are in the hierarchy, and so nothing can happen. So, and they don't get that you never know how the ripples are going to ripple out, or whatever you do as an individual might influence something. And that to me is like a some knot, some crucial thing there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. So, you know, yeah, you'll hear people get more sophisticated in talking about systems thinking. So they don't want to say they're trying to control the system. Then they'll say like mitigate, or we want to be resilient, or we want to be adapt. All these things are hedging. You can hear that they hedge their bet. And so when I was listening to you, I was thinking of like, okay, we live in a complex, volatile world. Every single person who says that, the whole reason why they're saying it is like, so what do we do about it to make it less complex and more volatile? Like the whole meme sits in that frame, right? So like we need to investigate the mental model behind the discourse. And what you said, Rhea, I think is really really significant, and that is To have no control, to not to be able to mitigate, to not be able to manage, doesn't mean you don't have agency. And that is a huge distinction, because I know for myself, when I get to thinking, well, do we just, the problem, see, for me, the problem with that, the way I address it is, in complex systems, you don't want to de-animate any of the players, let's say. And so to think you don't have agency de-animates you as a player and says the system has all the agency, right? But you don't want to de-animate the system or parts of the system as if I can operate on it without some kind of mutuality. So I think that was a big distinction. And I was going to ask, like, is there a choice possible in complexity? And so this notion, well, maybe not, but agency is, or something. That's a really interesting distinction.
I like to talk about that in terms of a paradox, because I think it is a paradox, right? You are you, and Bonnitta is particularly Bonnitta-ish, and Ria is particularly Ria-ish. And that particularity is your complexity. It's your history, your everything is in there. The way you perceive a situation, what you might do in response to it, has everything to do with your frame, your language, your whatever, your DNA. Everything is in there. But when you actually look at where all that comes from, it comes from the contexts around you. And so, in fact, you quickly get into a paradox of, well, is any of this stuff that's I think is me actually me, or is it from the context? And I refer to this as the paradox of agency. And what's really useful about this paradox is, as long as you can keep from solving it, you're in good shape. And that is that it keeps this kind of living, taut attention. And by taut, I don't mean teaching. I mean taut as in tight, as in pulled, stretched attention to kind of both as being what's there. Yes, I'm responding to the context that I'm around. In that sense, I don't have any agency. You can vote for Biden or you can vote for Trump. Choose. And is that agency? Or is that a choice that's set up within the meta contexts and patternings of an existing system? So do you have free will, or is it determined? This is old stuff, but basically the paradox is what's interesting. And that paradox, for me, is something that keeps the humility, and it keeps the questioning, and it keeps the dance and the toggle going between those different processes, so that I guess it's Harari, right, who's talking about free will, and he says, if you think you have free will, you don't have any, because especially in an algorithmed tech space, you're not actually making any choices. You're choosing between what's been given to you to choose from. But the second you realize you don't have any free will, you get a little bit. And there it is again, that paradox. So for me, this ties into, again, that attention to a way of being that is essentially in constant communication with the relationships and where they go, right? So what you do is not what you do, it's what you do and how that goes to the next thing and the next multiple things, how each path enters you into more paths, or enters the situation into more paths, how relationships build relationships.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, Nora, I think that's important, that to actually have that holistic complexity view, as Bonnie names it, that you start understanding way more of the relationships that are constantly going, instead of how I used to look a long time ago. It's like, okay, I'm here and you're over there, and that's it, as if there was nothing in between. But and if you really embody complexity, then you understand that there is this constant influence going all over the place from you towards you, and it's that thinking of we are in this skin and that is me, and then if I talk to you, maybe we have a relationship, but otherwise not. And that's, yes, something so fundamentally wrong is not the right word, but that doesn't work to understand how complex life actually happens.
For me, it reminded me of something Schopenhauer said. He said, I can will what I want, but I can't will that I will. Mm. And so for me, it's like, it's trying, yes, it's a paradox. I see it as tumbling perspectives, but trying to get a proper felt sense on what you were saying, Nora, which is beautiful. And that is, if I look at it from a certain viewpoint, the context, life is giving me, I don't have the choice but to act as if I were free. And that was not up to me. And so it's like, there's a larger intelligence in that design. And when then I ask myself if I free will, yes or no, I'm actually creating a context in which it can't be known, right? You just get into a pickle, some kind of conceptual pickle. But you can have these experiences where you have this strong felt sense that I don't have the choice not to be an agent. I don't have the choice to be a choiceless. I don't have the choice to not have free will. But there they are. Neither can I get out of acting as if. And so for me, I always believe the action, the felt sense, the embodied experience more than the pickle my mind can't solve. It's like, okay, well, language is too coarse a instrument to solve this pickle, but then you can have these experiences, and I don't want to hedge like then I'm an individual. That's not the point. And I think that, like, so why does it matter? And I think that we would all probably agree that relating to holistic complexity has something to do with the kind of processing your body does, or your actions and your feelings and your senses. And if you can learn, there's a sense in which you can learn to trust those. And it's not like then you get out of this system and you can pick a direction. But there's a way in which your communion or communication with the system shows you things that were hidden in plain sight, let's say. Shows you like, wow, I was running around in circles, and really there's a direct link from here to there that I didn't see, and it was easy. Shows you that you make a move and you know, like those ripples have more effect on the context than your little move, and that they will be disclosed to you eventually. And now you're starting to feel agency in the system, and it's very powerful.
Okay, I want to tell a story. When I was training in systemic constellations, some of you might know what that is, and I was then confused because my teacher used systemic constellations and there was systemic thinking. And I sensed, because I'm a very kinesthetic person, there was a difference. And I asked him, like, why are they using the same word, systemic? Because to me, it's not the same. And he said, I think what we mean is that you understand that you're part of the system. You cannot study the system from outside as if there's a system and I'm here, but I'm always implied whatever I do. And that was for me, I mean, it's now, I don't know how long time ago, but that was for me such a deep understanding about that.
I want to go into that thing that Bonnie, you started exploring there around the felt sense and the stay with it, and what's in there, because I think, you know, there's a lot of people who are they're looking for a methodology for how to get there. And it's a tricky space to actually put words on, because there's all sorts of possibilities for responding in any kind of systemic situation. And not all of them are going to resonate in multiple contextual processes simultaneously. And in particular, I think one of the things for me, that there are a couple things that come up here. And one is that it seems to require, you know, we like to talk about trust, but it seems to actually require a kind of distrust, a kind of abandonment of what the given set of explorations might be to solve the problem. And thinking, okay, but I know none of that's going to work. All of that is going to end up in some sort of reductionist frame. And so there is a you know, a part of me, and this is something that I think matures over time. And at first it might sound negative, it might sound critical, but I'm not coming from there. In my life, my experience with the most sort of singing, tingling responses to systemic issues, those responses come after you give up on the existing set of pathways. So that seems to be one piece of that. Another thing is that it's never where you think it's going to be. So if you start off thinking you're talking about education, or you start off thinking you're talking about, you know, a medical issue, where that other thing is going to come from is almost 100% of the time somewhere else. It's going to come from another context, and it's not going to look like any of the things on your list of what you're looking for. And so there is, there's that piece of it. And there's another thing that has to do with recognizing those things when they turn up. And that's, for me, that's a lifetime's work. And it isn't something that you do as a profession. It's something in the way that you live. You don't get to decide when that form of perception or those habits of thinking about things are turned on or turned off. It's not when you're on the job. It's not when you're teaching your systemic solutions course. It's all the time. And so I guess that those things are so interesting to me. And I certainly saw that, you know, with my dad in his later years. I wasn't around for his younger years, but it was something remarkable because those things would actually be in the immediate perception for him. I have to wait a little while and know that I'm going to have to get out of the habit of looking for this thing that I think I'm looking for, so that it's almost like your eyes have to retrain to get back. You know, when you get, especially when there's an urgent situation, responding to that urgency becomes very focused. And there's a need to have that focus move so that these other things can pop into your peripheral vision. But where are they? How and what does that look like? And so for me, I think that process is a deep one, and it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of courage, because usually there is an expectation that the solution is going to be definable in linear relationship to what has been identified as a problem. And generally it just isn't. It comes out of the sidelines, out of some other context.
Yeah, I wanna expand on the negativity. Because you remain so graceful through it. And kind of like bring this to practical affairs. And so like, I agree with you. You have to hit bottom. Like you're just so tired of doing the same. It's not only that it's in the wrong direction, it exacerbates the problem you're trying to solve, right? And you're so tired of that. And so what happens is, like, when you're working in these spaces, people that are on the Stoa or sense-making community, it's very frustrating because, again, you see the same kind of effort, the same kind of, there's a lot of novelty into the grammar or the modeling, and yet again, and you just want to like pull, I mean, this is my experience, you know, I just want to pull my hair out. And you don't want to get negative because there's something in the human condition that is flourishing and people are trying. And then you have to turn that lens on you and say, no, it's okay. Mm-hmm. This is part of it too. And so the question, like, one of the things that the way I talk about it is well, one of the things that I think poisons the well in these conversations when I start pulling my hair out is I have a very strong critique of the Darwinian attitude of complex adaptive processes, because everybody's adapting to everyone else. It's just a global reaction cycle, right? We're adapting to the climate's adapting to us, the markets, it's everything. It's like, you know, nuclear weapons and defense and finance and prices and vaccines and immune system. We're in a closed loop. And so for me, in complex adaptive systems thinking, you say, well, what do we do now? What do we, and I turn it into a process. I try to combine process philosophy with complex thought and say, what is possible from here? Wow, this is a surprise. What is possible from here? And so there's a sense of constantly being rebooted. And I like to tell this story. I read it in one of Carl Weick's books, and it's about, he tells this story about this indigenous hunter tribe in northern Canada or Norway, I can't remember, Greenland maybe. And their ritual for hunting elk has evolved holistically because it's just an old evolutionary process. Nobody thought of it. And what they do seems like magical thinking to us. After they finish using and eating every part of the elk, they take the shoulder bone from the elk, and it has to be the left or right, I can't remember, that's the ritual. And the elders who are skilled, they put the shoulder blade over the fire, and where the crack comes is where they head out in the next direction. Mm. And he says, the reason why, he says, they're not stupid, really. They know the elk drink down at the water hole at 4 o'clock. But if you get in that kind of like direct control mentality, then the elk gets smarter, and the whole system gets harder and harder to commune. Mm-hmm. So what they do is they introduce randomness into the process. And on the way, they discover more about their landscape, and they improve contexts that they don't even know they're improving. And the elk don't just become afraid of them. And then the dance and the mutuality is served by this relationship they have with randomness. Mm. And surprise. And so, yeah, so when I hear people speaking in terms of complex adaptive systems, I think it's not radical enough. It's in the Darwinian attitude, and it just escalates. It escalates action and reaction cycles to the point that that's what we have everywhere now. So that was my negative rant. I'll put it out there.
I know, though, it's so frustrating because, you know, when you start bringing in anything that is, you know, we live in a world of direct correctives. Mm. And if you operate in complex systems with direct correctives, you are gonna make consequences and consequences of consequences that you might be sorry you made. So yeah, detours and relational contours and dances and things that bring the expression that I like to use is that the shape of the response needs to meet the shape of the trouble. But what we do is we make the shape of the response match the shape of the trouble. And if it matches, that's a problem. But if it meets it, it's going to meet other things too. But go ahead, Ria, and then maybe we can give some examples of that later. Yeah, I interrupted you, sorry.
No. Because I don't think I was going to say something. Let me check. I wanted actually to pick something up from what was mentioned before, that I think you, Nora, mentioned the felt sense, and then Bonnie said something about embodiment and sensing, and I would say in that gap where we actually can act, and of course we live in contexts, that's for sure, and that drives our choices, yes. But there is, yeah, why do we do what we do? Why did I end up here? I mean, if I look at my history, nothing was expecting me to be here. I always said I'm just a little Flemish girl, you know, like from a worker's family, but there seems to be a sense that we can be in touch. I call it just life energy, and having a sense, and sometimes a very clear sense of that's what I need to do. And that is something I cannot not do if I'm really if I take myself seriously and my senses. And in that way, I always have advice for people, like make sure you know your body, you know what is going on, you know that what are these subtle clues that you can sense in yourself, but also, like what you said, Nora, to actually notice when the emergence happen, or that other strange thing that actually helps. You need to be sensitive is a better word, I guess, to actually notice, like, hey, here was something. Let's pick it up and not let it flood away with in the normal thinking, and oh, that was just a small detail and we don't pay attention. So there's a lot of, I want to put a lot of attention on get to know your instrument, your body as an instrument. Besides all the thinking, of course, not throw that away, but to actually have that also available.
Yeah, and I know, I think Adam Roberts here on this call, and I think his work toward, you know, trying to language, like perception is a skill. He keeps going. It's kind of this core theme of something that he's trying to work out, him in his work. I think is a part of that. You know, this perception is. You know, we think perception's frozen in time. You know, by the time you're 5 years old or whatever, the thing works, right? And then we go on to teach something else. But the question is, you know, I'm writing a philosophy of education book, and I argue that perception itself, everything that the core self, the core perceptual sensory motor self, needs to develop over time, along with then the other layers. And it's not just a step like development. Okay, you can walk, your mouth works right, you can see things, and then now we're going to pile things on top of that. And my dogs are going crazy, so I'll stop there.
It's great when you're trying to talk about language and your dogs just kick in. So yeah, I guess what I want to kind of bring in there is that it's also back to that context thing. Like, how much of the way that you or I or any one of you know, us or anyone sees the world is actually them seeing the world, and how much of that perception is actually shared perception. And I think this is where maybe sometimes when I want to pull my hair out, Bonnie, it's at this place where there's a shared perception, and I you know, for whatever reason, I'm on the other side of a one-way valve, and I can't go back to perceiving it that way. And I feel, I guess that recognition that perception isn't something that's just at the level of individual. And so when we talk about how it grows over time, it's also about how it's growing in between us over time. You know, words that come into the language, or concepts that come into culture, or experiences that are shared that shift the ability to perceive. It's that, you know, you can, when you add a coronavirus to the perception, that suddenly there's another way of actually of perceiving complexity, right? If you happen to be looking for it, not for everybody, but if you happen to be looking for it, And that sheds a very different light on education. It sheds a very different light on economy. It sheds a very different light on systemic racism, for example. The way that it was possible to perceive systemic racism after the coronavirus was different. It's like the alchemy of perception changed. And then because a lot of people were looking at the systemic issues, suddenly it was possible to see, something else happen. So this thing, it had always been there. So I think I guess one of the reasons I'm saying this is that I want to be really careful about getting somehow into a linear education process for how to perceive in this way, or that there's levels of ability to perceive in this way, and that they can be somehow identified, which drives me crazy, because I, work with little kids who are doing really fantastic transcontextual perception and description, and people from lots of different cultures at many different education levels and levels of experience of betrayal in the systems, and levels of living in levels of emergency that you might think would preclude the possibility to have such beautiful abstract thinking and to have the luxury of pontificating and exploring in this way, when you have to actually deal with an in-your-face emergency. And yet in those moments, there are definitely a lot of people who are right on it. So I just wanted to say that, because it can be perceived that there's some sort of leveling up. And I think that's the wrong metaphor to bring in. So I just want to bring that so that we have it in our, yeah. How are your dogs, Bonnie?
They've settled down. I was wondering if we wanted to go to questions, Peter?
Sure. Sounds good. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. Kim, I see that you have a question. If you can unmute yourself and ask it.
I think UV and Mike have a Google Doc that they've been populating also.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
They're way ahead of the game.
So they have a section, maybe, how do we engage in nonlinear thinking? Maybe that's something we can riff on while we have some questions come in the chat box.
I see Adam has one.
Adam, if you can unmute yourself.
Sure. I actually started writing this down while you were all talking. The session was really great.
Your mic is pretty muffled, Adam.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think I need to make an adjustment here. Why don't you move on to somebody else and I'll come back.
All right. Jacob, you have a question.
Hi there. Hi, ladies.
Hello.
So don't take this personally, because it's just a general frustration I have, and I'm seeing it play out a bit here. And maybe you could clear it up and I'll view this thing completely different. I'm open to that. But I hear this thing happening where, like, I hear all these ideas that are, some of them are good, some are bad, right? And those the bad ones are good and the good ones are good. The ones that I hate are the ones that are super contradictive. So you have like I've heard like at least 74 ideas that contradict each other here out of the same mouth. And so, and then, thanks for laughing, because this isn't good. I hope you see it's coming from a good place. I just care about this a lot. Is what I see happening is that there'll be a contradictory idea and then people claim paradox. It's like, well, oh, there's paradoxes in the universe, and we forgive ourselves for our contradictions. Because actually paradoxes are really, really rare. They're like rare birds that are beautiful, and that like you can't claim them all the time. Like a sparrow isn't a paradox. You know what I'm saying? Like they're rare birds. And so what's mostly happening is contradictions are being called paradoxes. Because if you call contradictions paradoxes, then you leave them alone. But you need to, if you know something's not a paradox but a contradiction, you have to confront it and deal with it. So do you have a mechanism in place when you're speaking and listening to make a distinction between paradox and contradiction? Because if we don't, we shouldn't even talk. I mean, I take that back. But we shouldn't be an authority, because we have to be able to do that. So do you have some sort of mechanism in place that can do that? Thanks for listening.
Yeah, so that's where you can bring that kind of rigor to this work. And so I agree with you that most paradoxes are contradictions. I use the word pickle. Most contradictions that we're calling paradoxes, you can see that the semantic, you're basically using words from one mental model and making some kind of category error in another mental model, and you haven't, I call it semantic mapping. You haven't cleared out the clutter. So you're using the word, for example, we made one distinction between agency and control, okay? So what you need to do, in fact, most, if not all of them, get solved. I don't actually believe that in the end you hold paradox. So if you look at the work of Ralph Stacey, that's where he gets to. But there's a move in which you can see the paradox arises in a context, a mental model that you've set up that necessarily moves you toward paradox if you reason within it. And if you can see the limitations of your mental model, then the paradox goes away, or the contradiction. I'm talking about those things we call paradoxes that you are saying are contradictions. So, so there is a metacognitive move that will resolve, in my opinion, all of them. But you have to see you've set up the pickle in the first place by the way you're semantically mapping within a mental model. So for example, I'll give you just an easy one. When we're talking about complex systems, people might say something, and you realize that what they're saying is because they can only say that if they have a mental model of a certain type of causation. You can hardly say it, you can hardly say this happens because, or whatever, without inserting this mental model of causation. And because you're trying to talk about holistic emergence, but you're somehow implied this theory of change, this theory of causation, you'll come up with a paradox. And then you'll realize, oh, I can't look at that and hold on to the semantic structure of this theory of causation without coming to a paradox. Hence, I need a brand new theory of causation. So there are people working in this field that say, what's a causal theory in this domain that doesn't lead to paradox? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of that kind of work. So you're very bright to bring this up. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting work. If you wanted to actually say we're capable of grasping this, moving from the liminal kind of relationship to this to something more metacognitive. That's an interesting career that you could choose. It's a lot of work, yeah, so I have a chapter coming out in the Meta Modern Reader that talks about the metaphysical primes of modernity that will never, ever, ever let you understand what Nora Bateson is talking about. You have to exit them. But if we showed up using language, like we have to show up, we use the language. And so we end up with these contradictions. And so, yeah. So I love that work, but it's really geeky. That's, it's really highly metacognitive.
And I love that.
Can I just say one thing? So that was a long answer. I wish I understood more of it. I would have to maybe listen again. But so I think the answer is just simply this. You just need a bird book to identify the birds.
I don't get it. So is that like semantic mapping?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
semantic mapping indeed.
Yeah, semantic mapping. That's what I call it. You asked for a methodology. Yeah.
Semantic mapping that's rooted in ancient history or something. But we can have this conversation another time. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah.
But I think what you're onto is something really important, because what could be a paradox in one context might not be a paradox in another context. So that's another issue that is part of this, parsing this out, that I think it's worth paying attention to. And for me, there's another thing in here too. Is it a contradiction? Is it a paradox? Is it a double bind? Is it a dilemma? Right? There's all sorts of different creatures that come in this pickle bottle, and how each one of these, sort of relational patterns of predicament have they have something that is like a portal into a whole nest of relational information through multiple contexts. And in that sense, it's important to, be rigorous with the grammar for sure. But I think that what is also interesting is to play with that entry point into moments where what I would, this is why I'm interested in warm data in a nutshell, is that which is an artifact of data in one context is changed when you put it in time and when you put it in complex, moving, responding processes. So what the heck is information when it's moving? So for me, these entry points, the pickles, the paradoxes, the double binds, the dilemmas, the contradictions, the inconsistencies, they move around, and in different contexts they show up as different characters. So I think that's important too. But in any case, they are openings into relational information.
Yeah, so what is a paradox in Newtonian physics? You're curious, you're looking around, and then you find a paradox, and that paradox dissolves in the Einsteinian paradigm.
Exactly.
But before you get the new paradigm, your language is going to be paradoxical because you only have the language of the old paradigm. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah.
I don't have all the sophisticated words, but how it has worked in me is like, I come from the late feminist background. And so my worldview was very feminist at some point. And then there was the feminine and there was the masculine. And over time, I always explain it as I can expand my box, and suddenly that whole dynamic tension is gone, at least for me. And so there is that, the individual and the collective, and having this at certain points in my life struggle with that, and then over time, I can expand my understanding, and then that paradox or whatever we call it is not an issue anymore, because I seem to have a wider container to hold it all or something. I think, and that's how we move on in understanding, and probably also in language. I don't know.
All right, Adam, your mic is fixed.
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for this. I'll just jump right into the question. We spend a lot of time thinking about, or kind of rethinking how we might salvage concepts of free will, right? Like that's kind of where this conversation started. And I heard Nora and Bonnitta talk about, well, maybe there's a more kind of a limited account of free will as a kind of agency that operates within sort of different kinds of determined systems, and then kind of understanding the nature of those determined systems is some way of reclaiming agency, right? And as long as we're emphasizing the free will pole, the goal seems to be something like, can we line up all of these internal and external variables as best we can, somehow account for them, and then counteract them, right? The goal seems to be we're looking for greater control, greater freedom. People use the word sovereignty, right? There's this whole work of like gaining sovereignty. And it's kind of like you were saying, like you end up creating these like very extensive maps about things that could be like controlling you so that you can control them. But I'm wondering what happens if we kind of like run the system in the other direction and actually think more clearly about like what's this is kind of an emergent thought I'm having as you were speaking. Is there a kind of a positive version of determinism? Just like we can probably identify that there's a negative version of free will. There are freely willed acts that we frankly would wish people didn't engage in. And so I carry around, these kinds of oddball concepts with me, like grace and coincidence and flow. And these are things that phenomenologically have the character of acting on me, or kind of picking me up and getting me to do things that seem to be the right things to do, things that I'm not sort of consciously willing and picking up on. But the agency feels like it's coming from the outside. So it has that kind of character of like falling in the determinism basket. But it doesn't feel like I'm being closed off. It doesn't have this kind of mechanically deterministic feeling to it. It doesn't feel negative. And in a lot of cases, it actually feels like by following that larger system or following that nudge, I'm actually being put to better use than whatever I as an individual would have, put myself to do in my own acts of making choices. So it's kind of like an intuitive nudge or inclination, or something acting within you that's not you, and so has that character of you being determined, but it also has this like kind of positive quality to it. And so I'm just wondering, what do we think about that? Are we still in the language of free will and determinism here? Does it make sense to talk about this kind of grace acting inside of you as an aspect of determinism that's positive? Or is this something else? Should we use a different language than determinism here? And so that just kind of was shooting up as you were speaking. And so I just wanted to know what everybody thought about that.
Interesting. I've come across that. For myself, some of the listeners know the story that at a certain point I was looking for the book that would describe what I was experiencing in groups of people and in dialogue, and realized then that, oh, the book doesn't exist, and it's probably me who has to write a book. And that felt like something, as I said, I could not do that. And but deterministic is for me not the right word. And I have solved it, for lack of anything better, in my book. Like, there seems to be a level of calling. You can call it soul's calling, or I guess that was the only word that came close to what I was sensing for myself. I don't know, because there's also something like, there is also to make a choice at that point. Like, even if I sense, oh, it's probably me to write a book, I still have to decide myself. There is a choice to make, to actually go there and take the consequences and take the time to invest in it and all that. I don't know if that's any answer, but I think it becomes more, I see it as becoming more important as we move on. Short version.
So, did my geeky thing. Yeah, so I think there's several different moves that are in your question as you composed it, Adam. And I think a couple of them I'm sure you're aware of. It's, do I have free will? Well, who is the I, right? Is it the persona? Is it myself? And then I wonder about deterministic. Or is it the universe? Or is it, let's say the universe is the whole. Does the whole have free will? Well, it doesn't make sense to ask if the whole has free will, because inside the question, see, very sophisticated question, very limiting causal framework. Because when you ask that question, you're basically adopting the collision theory of causality. My mind moves my hand moves the axe. What moves my mind? You're stuck in a linear mental model of causality called the collision theory. So, and that's what I was trying to say earlier. So the paradox of free will is a byproduct of a certain framework of causality. And so, knowing that, then when I ask, does the whole have free will? I expose that, because if it's the whole, then nothing's going to bump against it to make it move, right? So that's one thing that's interesting. And so the process move is the whole creative, right? Is there creative acts de novo, novel acts in the universe? And then I can work from that. And it brings us back to surprise and unpredictable. Since my actions are completely unknowable and unpredictable, and I'm constantly surprised, the fact that I have no control means actually I have free will if I semantically map it back to the original question. So we put these words in clusters under different mental models, and then we have this pickle arise. But if you make these move and extract what context, what conceptual or perceptual context the question is lying on, you can see that you've created yourself a little pickle, and you're asking the question within it. So if you ask it from the whole, does the whole have creativity? And that's answering that, if you map it back down, is the answer to, is there free will? But we're lacking a causal theory that connects that, because we don't have a new causal theory.
I guess that in addition to what Ria and Bonnitta have said here, I just want to add that I think the reason we're asking that question, and that question is so alive in Western culture in particular, is because there is a whole sort of nest of complicated, complex, both, I would say, ways of thinking about this question of the self and what the self can do and what the self has done and how the self is in some way identified with its doing and its what has been done. And in some ways, this is tied to all sorts of hero stuff. It's tied to, it's tied to the way we give out prizes and we say this belongs to that person or that belongs to this person. So there's an awful lot in that sensibility that would inquire to begin with. Okay, so there's two things that I think we need to ask here. One is your question, Adam, or that old question, right? Both of those things are there. What is the difference between free will and determinism? Do we have either one? Is it possible to have a good determinism but then the other question I think is important is what does it tell us about a way of perceiving in which that question is being asked? And I think this brings us back to the beginning of the conversation that gets to that frustration around getting caught in linear solutioning. And we're back where we started from again, and how to, this thing, I say it all the time, be in the system of the system and think you can change the system from within it. There's this matrix sort of thing happening, and not to polarize with the system because that makes it stronger, not to perpetuate it, not to prove it, not to, how do you where's the change? I think what we're asking is where's the change, and how can we participate in something that allows us to get to new patterns of living, perceiving, relating that are less destructive. I'm hoping when I use the royal we there, the dangerous we, that's why this question is coming up. It isn't always that, but I think I'm going to stop there. But there's something about, if you do something, you can see that you did it. But if you don't do something, you also did something. And how to do something about the terrible destructive patterns of our socio-economic, cultural systems in a way that isn't riddled with so much of the blindness of what it is that could be perceived right now. In Shakespearean plays, so often the characters perceive that they're going to get ahead they're going to get to be king if they can just kill the king. And the perception is if you kill the king, you can be the king. I'm being facetious, but essentially there's a perception, and getting back to sort of where some of the territory we've covered, there's a causality that is perceived. There's a perceived functioning causality, and if that perceived functioning causality turns out to be, let's just say, limited, if not completely destructive and perpetuating of existing systems, I think the question that the three of us are I think working with is how to perceive, how to be in that perception of seeing more of, not all, because you'll never see all, but not to get caught in the goals at the wrong level. Yeah, so I think that's part of this as well.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Might be a good time to close out. And so I want to invite Bonnitta, Nora, and Ria for any closing thoughts. Maybe we can go around the circle.
Can you say something about what is happening in the Google Doc and something? Just because I cannot do listening and looking at chat and Google Doc, but I noticed there was something happening. I think it's good to mention that.
Yeah, if I can take Mike and Yuvi for that.
Yeah, it kind of started off as just a series of questions related to linear thinking and nonlinear thinking, and then also attempting to answer them, and then just kind of pulling apart more complexity and more questions out of it. So it's a little bit of a confusing map, and then everyone started contributing about, I think it's about double or triple the size than when it started now. So I can see a lot of people still contributing, asking questions. Hard to sum it up though.
It's kind of a non-linear picture of
non-linear thinking.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I just want to just bump in one other thing on the free will, because it illustrates also the notion of paradox. Because if you don't have the notion of the collision model of cause and effect, you neither have a concept of free will, because if there's no cause and effect, what is free will? You can't will something to, and you no longer have the concept of determinism. So this is an example of showing that the paradox, the pickle, arises from a context, a deeper context, and that is there's an implicit causality that asks the question. So I just thought it was an interesting that it came up, and that was one of the big questions early on. Yeah. So what's the invitation again, Peter, for us here?
Closing thoughts before we make upcoming announcements.
Yeah, I guess we had an intention to give people a flavor of there's a distinction between a certain type of approach that comes under systems thinking and something that we try to exemplify or share a language for you this would be my thing as a strange attractor, because people are, so many people right almost there, you know? And what kind of world would we perceive if a critical mass of people lived in that paradigm? So hopefully we gave you a taste of that, or a provocative.
I think the only thing I would want to also add to what Ria and Bonnitta have said, and thank you, it's been wonderful to be in conversation with both of you, and really delicious, because it's I think it's time to actually give a kind of credibility and authorization to another kind of thinking and working with systems. And I think we started off talking about that frustration. And for me, that frustration has everything to do with what happens when systems thinking becomes mechanistic. And that something vital, something living is lost. and that lost thing is going to prohibit the kind of meta, substantive, aesthetic, deep relational and second order relational change that I think is only possible through indirect response. And having said that, I want to give the caveat that even to this question of grammar and semantics, even the notion of direct and indirect could switch. So right now, that thing we know as a direct corrective, I would hope, and I would suggest, may someday be perceived as a really indirect corrective. And those things that are coming in what we now perceive as indirect ways, through multiple contextual processes coming together, and it comes from the outside somewhere, or so it seems, that is a much more direct way to actually be in this dance or this interplay with complex systems. So for me, I think what I want to do, since I have these beautiful people here to say it with me, is I just want to give credibility to that, because more often than not, there isn't credibility there. And without that credibility, I don't know how we can begin to move into another texture, another depth, another rigor of systems thinking. So thank you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Nora. I've seen you once, but that was a long time ago. And I also want to name the audience here, although I haven't followed the chat because that's too confusing for me, but that's part of the complexity. It was not just the three of us talking. There was a lot more going on all kinds of levels. And it would, yeah, I just talked yesterday with Bonnie, like, how can we design this, that even that complexity and the intelligence that, because it's not just Bonnie and Nora and I who are the ones who know here. That's really bullshit. And for me, that's part of actually embodying complexity, is like trusting the collective wisdom and looking for ways that we can maybe need to invent to get more of that, or to, I don't know. That's what I'm leaving with, inspired by the conversation yesterday with Bonnie. Like, can we do whatever the ripple effect is of this? Maybe somehow we can activate it more or something. I don't know. That's me. Thank you for the invitation.
All right, so we'll close here. I'll make a few announcements, but first, Bonnitta, Nora, Ria, thank you so much for that beautiful and delicious conversation. I would love to have you back for another emergent conversation. If you'd like to continue this, we have a Discord now. Here's an invitation for it. And I think I'll take Bonnitta's advice and have these like post-sense making sessions like kind of Daniel Thorson does with his podcast, so we can kind of make sense of this and embody it. And thanks for Mike, for UV, for giving that idea with the Google Doc Live. That's pretty awesome. I think I'll incorporate that into the Stoa. So in upcoming events, in 15 minutes here, we have a bioemotive framework with Doug Tatterin. It's a really interesting psychotherapeutic modality that really gets to the heart and the mind. It's a 30-minute test or teaser of it. So Doug's going to come in and do a demo live. So check that out. That's the direct Zoom link. We have a SenseMaker in Residence series. Dave Snowden, who's mentioned here a few times. He's coming in, he's our sense maker in residence for September. It's naturalizing sense making. You can check that out on the website. Bonnitta, Roy, you have one. You want to plug that, the Hollow, for October?
Yeah, so the Hollow, as in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a hollow is a wooded, riverine, secret place where people would come to coast, conspire around change in the world, and it's apropos to the upcoming Halloween. Let's meet there in the Hollow and become secret agents of change.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that one. That's in October, Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern time or something like that. Just check the website. And we just posted a new event. Brett Weinstein is coming in September 21st at 6 p.m. Eastern time to talk about his Unity 2020 project. So if you have any questions for him, to stress test it, feel free to come there. And of course, Ria Baeck has a session every Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern time on collective presencing. So if you want to actually engage in these type of conversations with us here at the Stoa, you can go RSVP on the website. And if you'd like to support the Stoa, what we're doing here with all these kind of free activities during this meta crisis, meaning crisis, you can support us on Patreon. The link is in the chat. All right, so everyone, thank you so much for coming up today.
Thank you so much, Peter, Nora, and Ria.